uncovering covered-up historical events, exposing the secrets of the past history, as it's commonly taught, often glosses over or outright ignores events that reveal uncomfortable truths about power, control, and the consequences of decisions made by those in authority. But history isn't static. Thanks to relentless researchers, whistleblowers, and activists, many hidden stories have finally been revealed. Let's delve into some major events that were buried or misrepresented and uncover the truths that have reshaped our understanding of the past. 1. The Tulsa Race Massacre, 1921. The Tulsa Race Massacre is one of the most devastating and violently suppressed events in American history. Taking place over 18 hours on May 31st and June 1st, 1921, in the prosperous African-American community of Greenwood, Tulsa, the massacre led to the destruction of what was known as Black Wall Street. The event began when a young black man, Dick Rowland, was accused of assaulting a white woman in an elevator, though the details of the incident were never substantiated. Tensions erupted and a white mob descended on Greenwood, looting, burning, and killing indiscriminately. Scale of destruction: an estimated 100 to 300 people were killed, thousands were left homeless, and over 1,000 homes and businesses were destroyed. Aircraft were even used to drop incendiary devices, making the event one of the first times aerial attacks were used on civilians in the United States. Why it was covered up? Local authorities and newspapers actively suppressed information about the massacre. Official records were altered, and survivors were intimidated into silence. The event wasn't taught in schools, and many Americans remained unaware of it for decades. The uncovering. Renewed efforts in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, driven by historians, journalists, and the descendants of survivors, have brought the massacre to public attention. Commemorations, documentaries, and books have since shed light on this horrific chapter, prompting discussions about reparations and systemic racism. 2. The Caton Massacre, 1940. The Caton Massacre was a mass execution of over 22,000 Polish military officers, intellectuals, and other elites carried out by the Soviet Union's secret police, NKVD, in the spring of 1940. The victims were buried in mass graves in the Caton Forest and other locations. When Nazi Germany discovered these graves in 1943, they accused the Soviets of the crime. The Soviet Union, however, blamed the Nazis, and the truth was concealed for decades. Why it was covered up. During World War II, the Western Allies needed to maintain a strong relationship with the Soviet Union to defeat Nazi Germany. Acknowledging Soviet responsibility would have strained that alliance, so the United States and the United Kingdom downplayed the evidence. The uncovering. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, as the Soviet Union began to collapse, more documents were declassified, and the Russian government admitted that the NKVD had indeed carried out the massacre. The Caton Massacre remains a symbol of the devastating impact of political cover-ups and has left deep scars in Polish-Russian relations. 3. Project MKUltra, 1950s-1970s. MKUltra was a top-secret CIA program that experimented with mind control and behavioral manipulation, often using unwitting human subjects. The project aimed to explore techniques for interrogations and brainwashing during the Cold War. Experiments included administering drugs like LSD, using sensory deprivation, and even psychological torture. Many subjects experienced long-term psychological damage, and at least one participant, Frank Olson, died under mysterious circumstances. Why it was covered up. The CIA was desperate to find methods to counter perceived threats from the Soviet Union and other foreign adversaries. The agency destroyed most of the MKUltra documents in 1973 to avoid scandal and accountability. The uncovering. The project was exposed in the mid-1970s during congressional hearings, such as the Church Committee and the Rockefeller Commission. These investigations revealed the appalling scope of the program, leading to greater oversight of government agencies and a more comprehensive understanding of unethical experimentation. 4. The United Fruit Company and U.S. involvement in Central America, 1950s. In the 1950s, the United Fruit Company, an American corporation with massive land holdings in Central America, lobbied the U.S. government to intervene in Guatemala when President Jacobo Arbenz implemented land reforms. These reforms threatened the company's economic interests, so the CIA launched Operation PBS Success in 1954, overthrowing Arbenz and installing a military dictatorship. The coup led to decades of political instability and violence in Guatemala. Why it was covered up? The U.S. justified the intervention by claiming it was necessary to prevent communism from spreading in the Western Hemisphere. The economic motivations behind the coup were hidden, and the impact on Guatemala's people was minimized. The uncovering declassified CIA documents in the 1990s revealed the true extent of U.S. involvement and the devastating consequences of the coup. The United Fruit Company's role became a case study in how corporate interests can drive foreign policy, and the event continues to spark debates about American imperialism. Number 5. The Chernobyl Disaster, 1986. On April 26, 1986, reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in the Soviet Union exploded, releasing massive amounts of radioactive material into the atmosphere. The Soviet government initially tried to cover up the severity of the disaster, and it wasn't until neighboring countries detected high radiation levels that the world began to understand the scope of the crisis. The delayed response and inadequate information led to thousands of deaths and long-term health issues for millions. Why it was covered up. The Soviet Union's desire to maintain a facade of technological and governmental strength led to a slow and inadequate response. Admitting to a catastrophic failure would have undermined the image of Soviet competence. The uncovering. As the international community pressured the Soviet Union, more details emerged. The 2019 HBO miniseries Chernobyl brought renewed attention to the disaster, highlighting the heroism of those who risked their lives to contain the damage and the systemic issues that worsened the crisis. 6. Operation Condor, 1970s to 1980s. Operation Condor was a secret collaboration between right-wing dictatorships in South America, including Chile, Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, Uruguay, and Bolivia, to suppress left-wing political opposition. This operation involved surveillance, torture, assassinations, and forced disappearances, often with support from the United States. Tens of thousands of people were killed or disappeared under this brutal campaign. Why it was covered up? The operation was framed as a necessary fight against communism during the Cold War. The U.S. government, which provided intelligence and resources, did not want to be publicly associated with human rights abuses. The uncovering. The truth about Operation Condor came out through the efforts of human rights organizations, declassified documents, and the testimonies of survivors. Trials for some of the perpetrators have been held in recent years, but many families are still seeking justice for their lost loved ones. 7. The Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment, 1932 to 1972. The Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment was a 40-year study conducted by the U.S. Public Health Service on the effects of untreated syphilis in African American men. Participants were misled and told they were receiving free health care, but they were not given proper treatment even after penicillin became widely available. The study caused immense suffering and contributed to a deep mistrust of the medical establishment among African Americans. Why it was covered up. The study was rationalized as being for the greater good of science, and government officials failed to intervene despite knowing the unethical nature of the research. The systemic racism underlying the study was ignored or justified for decades. The uncovering. A whistleblower exposed the experiment to the media in 1972, causing public outrage. The study's unethical practices led to changes in medical research ethics, including the requirement for informed consent and the establishment of institutional review boards. 8. The Iran-Contra Affair, 1980s. The Iran-Contra Affair was a political scandal in the United States during the Reagan administration. Senior officials secretly facilitated the sale of arms to Iran, which was under an arms embargo, and used the proceeds to fund the Contras, a rebel group in Nicaragua fighting the Sandinista government. This was done despite a congressional ban on funding the Contras. Why it was covered up. The operation was carried out covertly to avoid public scrutiny and legal repercussions. The Reagan administration wanted to secure hostages held by Iranian-backed groups and support anti-communist forces in Latin America, but doing so violated U.S. law. The uncovering. The scandal was exposed in 1986, leading to congressional hearings and multiple convictions. However, many of those involved were later pardoned, and the affair remains a controversial example of governmental overreach and the consequences of covert operations. The importance of exposing hidden histories. Each of these events, once buried or distorted, represents a broader narrative about how history can be manipulated by those in power. The uncovering of these events often reveals systemic issues, whether it's racial injustice,